It happened at exactly 11:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, under the blinding glare of television lights that made the air in the Rayburn House office building feel thin and superheated. The House Oversight Committee hearing room was packed to capacity, a claustrophobic sea of suits, press passes, and nervous energy. Outside, the line to get in stretched down the marble hallway. Inside, the tension was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chest. This was the main event. This was the moment the political world had been waiting for. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar versus FBI Director Kash Patel. The narrative had been set for weeks. Omar, the fiery progressive prosecutor, was coming to dismantle Patel, the perceived Trump loyalist who was allegedly weaponizing the Bureau against his political enemies. Chairman Mike Johnson banged the gavel 3 times. Bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed off the high ceilings like gunshots, silencing the murmurs of the gallery. "This hearing of the House Oversight Committee is now in session," Johnson announced, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of anticipation. "We are here today to address concerns raised by several members regarding Federal Bureau of Investigation practices and allegations of politically motivated investigations targeting sitting members of Congress." He looked down at the witness table. Seated there, entirely alone, was Kash Patel. There was no phalanx of lawyers flanking him, no nervous aides whispering in his ear, no binders of talking points prepared by a crisis communications firm. There was just Kash, a leather portfolio, a glass of water, and an expression of unnatural calm. He looked less like a bureaucrat facing an inquisition and more like a poker player holding a royal flush, waiting for the betting to finish. "Director Patel, thank you for appearing voluntarily today," Johnson said. Patel adjusted his microphone, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am happy to answer any questions the committee has." Before the echo of his voice had faded, Ilhan Omar leaned into her microphone. She looked every inch the prosecutor she imagined herself to be. Dressed in a bold purple hijab and a sharp, tailored black suit, she radiated confidence. She had her sound bites ready. She had her clips prepared for MSNBC. She was ready to draw blood. "Director Patel," her voice cut through the room, sharp and accusatory. "I'm going to get straight to it, because the American people deserve straight answers." She paused for effect, making sure the red tally light on the center camera was on her. Over the past 6 months, multiple progressive members of Congress have reported being followed, having their communications monitored, and being subjected to what can only be described as harassment by federal law enforcement. Omar began, her voice rising in a practiced crescendo. "This committee has received multiple whistleblower reports, credible reports, suggesting that the FBI is maintaining active surveillance operations on at least a dozen sitting members of Congress." The room buzzed. Journalists leaned forward, fingers hovering over keyboards. This was the accusation they had printed rumors about, but hearing it said on the record changed the gravity of the room. "These aren't random members, Director," Omar continued, her eyes locking onto Patel. "They are progressives. They are Muslims. They are people of color. They are members who dare to speak truth to power, who criticize American foreign policy, who demand accountability from institutions like yours." She leaned forward, closing the physical distance between them. "So, let me start with a simple question. I want a yes or no answer. No spin, no bureaucracy, just the truth. Is the FBI currently investigating any sitting member of Congress?" The room went deathly silent. This was the trap. If Patel said no, and evidence came out later, he was perjuring himself. If he said yes, he was admitting to the very political witch hunt Omar was accusing him of. She smiled slightly, believing she had checkmated him in the first 60 seconds. Kash Patel didn't flinch. He didn't look at his notes. He looked directly at her, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Yes, Congresswoman." The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Photographers' cameras erupted in a frenzy of clicks that sounded like a swarm of mechanical locusts. A Republican member in the back row muttered something audible only to his neighbors, his eyes wide. Omar blinked. She hadn't expected him to admit it so easily. But she recovered quickly, her smile widening into something triumphant. "And how many of those investigations target Muslim or progressive members?" she demanded, pressing her advantage. "Some of the individuals under investigation identify as progressive," Patel said, his voice maddeningly calm. "Some identify as Muslim. But, Congresswoman, I need to clarify something important regarding the nature of—" "I asked for yes or no answers, Director," Omar shouted, cutting him off. "This is exactly what we feared. This is political persecution, disguised as law enforcement. You are targeting members who speak truth to power. You are weaponizing the state against your enemies." "Congresswoman," Patel's voice cut through her monologue. It wasn't loud, but it had a hard edge to it now, like steel under velvet. "You asked for a yes or no. I gave you a yes. But context matters in law. May I provide it?" "You can provide it after you answer my questions," Omar snapped, waving her hand dismissively. She was high on the adrenaline of the moment, playing to the cameras, playing to the base. She didn't see the cliff she was sprinting toward. "Director, have you personally authorized surveillance on any member of this committee?" 3 rows back in the gallery, Omar's personal lawyer froze. He stopped writing. He stared at the back of her head, his mouth slightly open, shaking his head in a desperate, silent plea. "Don't ask that. Do not open that door." But Ilhan Omar couldn't see him. She only saw a bureaucrat she was about to destroy. "I am waiting for your answer, Director," she pressed. "Have you authorized surveillance on us?" Patel took a slow breath. He looked at the Congresswoman with an expression that, in hindsight, looked almost like pity. "Congresswoman," Patel said, "I don't personally authorize individual surveillances, but I do review and approve investigation recommendations from field offices when they meet probable cause standards established by federal law. So, to answer your question, if a member of this committee is under investigation, it is because career FBI agents, not political appointees, found evidence of potential federal crimes serious enough to warrant one." "Potential federal crimes," Omar scoffed, the sound dripping with disdain. "That is a very convenient phrase. Director, care to elaborate on what crimes you are accusing sitting members of Congress of committing?" The trap was set. The bait was taken. The hunter had just become the hunted. The room had gone quiet again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It wasn't the excited hush of a political spectacle anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom right before the verdict is read. Kash Patel looked at Ilhan Omar for a long, deliberate moment. He interlocked his fingers on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Congresswoman," Patel said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Are you sure you want me to answer that question? In open session? On live television?" It was a warning. It was a lifeline. It was a neon sign flashing, "Turn back now." Her lawyer was half out of his seat in the gallery, his face pale, trying desperately to catch her eye, to signal a recess, to fake a coughing fit, anything to stop what was about to happen. But Omar was blinded by the lights and her own hubris. She interpreted Patel's hesitation as weakness. She thought he was bluffing. She thought he was trying to hide the fact that he had nothing. "I asked you a direct question, Director," Omar said, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. "What crimes are you accusing members of Congress of? Or are you afraid to state them publicly because they don't exist?" Patel held her gaze for one more beat. Then he nodded slowly, the gesture of a man who had done his due diligence and was now absolved of the consequences. "I haven't accused anyone, Congresswoman," Patel said, "but since you are asking for specifics in open session—" He turned slightly and signaled to an aide standing by the side wall, a young man holding a heavy cardboard box. "Let's talk about the evidence." The aide moved with practiced efficiency. He walked down the line of the committee dais, distributing folders to every single member. These weren't standard manila folders. They were bright, alarming red. They were thick, bound with heavy clips, and stamped on the front in bold black ink. "Cleared for public session. DOJ OGE approved." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Members of Congress, usually bored and distracted, snatched the folders up. Republicans opened them and their jaws dropped. Democrats opened them and began speed reading, their eyes widening in panic as they realized what they were holding. Omar's hands were shaking slightly as she broke the seal on her folder. The sound of tearing paper seemed amplified by the microphone. She opened it. The first page was a summary. Her eyes scanned the text, and the color drained from her face. Patel waited patiently. He took a sip of water. He looked like a professor waiting for his class to finish reading a particularly difficult passage. "What you are looking at," Patel said, his voice cutting through the rustling of paper, "are redacted summaries of 3 ongoing FBI investigations. These files detail campaign finance violations, wire fraud, and potential Foreign Agents Registration Act violations involving current House members." He paused, ensuring every word was heard. "These summaries have been cleared by the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel and the Office of Government Ethics specifically for this hearing. You asked for transparency, Congresswoman. This is it." Omar looked up from the folder. Her eyes were wide, darting around the room. The confident prosecutor was gone. In her place was someone who realized the floor had just dropped out from under her. This is highly irregular," she stammered, her voice losing its projection. "You can't just distribute active investigation files to the committee." "Congresswoman," Patel's voice was sharp now, slicing through her objection. "You called this hearing. You demanded transparency about FBI investigations into members of Congress. You summoned me here under subpoena to answer questions about those investigations. I am providing exactly what you demanded." He leaned into the microphone. "Or would you prefer we discuss this in a closed session? I am happy to reconvene in a SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility, right now, if you'd like. Just say the word." It was the ultimate gamble. If she demanded a closed session now, she would look guilty. She would look like she was hiding something from the public she claimed to champion. If she continued, she was walking through a minefield blindfolded. The silence that followed was excruciating. 47 million people watching at home held their breath. Her pride made the choice for her. "I have nothing to hide, Director," Omar said, though her voice sounded brittle, like dry leaves stepping on pavement. Let's continue right here. But I want to be clear. This seems like a coordinated attack on— May I ask you a question, Congresswoman? Patel interrupted. Omar blinked, thrown off rhythm. This is my question time, Director. Of course, Patel said smoothly. Then let me answer your original question more specifically. He opened his own red folder. It lay flat on the table, a mirror image of the one shaking in her hands. You asked what crimes we are investigating when it involves members of Congress, Patel said. Let me start with case file 2021 DC 4478. He looked down at the page, reading the file number with the precision of an accountant. This case involves $2.7 million in campaign expenditures paid to a consulting firm. This firm is owned by an individual with whom the candidate allegedly had an undisclosed personal and romantic relationship during the period of payment. Patel looked up. The investigation began after a formal complaint filed by the National Legal and Policy Center in March 2020. It alleges that campaign funds were used for personal expenses in violation of Federal Election Commission regulations. Under federal statute, this potentially constitutes wire fraud. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the servers in the back. Omar was frozen. Director, she whispered, Are you discussing my campaign? Patel looked at her with the cold, unblinking stare of the law. Congresswoman, you asked what crimes we investigate when it involves sitting members of Congress. I am giving you a specific example. If the details sound familiar, that is because they are drawn from public FEC complaints, financial disclosures, and documents obtained through lawful investigative process. Republican Jim Jordan leaned into his microphone, sensing blood in the water. Director Patel, to clarify for the record, is Congresswoman Omar currently under FBI investigation? Patel didn't break eye contact with Omar. Congressman Jordan, I cannot confirm or deny the identity of specific subjects in ongoing investigations without further DOJ approval. However, what I can say is that case file 2021 DC 4478 involves a sitting House member representing Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. The gasp from the gallery was audible. There was only one person fitting that description. She was sitting right there, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table, realizing that the red folder in front of her wasn't a prop. It was an indictment. The silence in the hearing room had a texture to it now. It was gritty, uncomfortable, the feeling of sand in an engine that is about to seize. Ilhan Omar sat frozen, her hand hovering near her water glass, her eyes locked on the red folder lying open in front of Kash Patel. Let's start with the basics, Congresswoman, Patel said, his voice dropping into the steady, rhythmic cadence of a seasoned prosecutor laying out a closing argument. Case file 2021 DC 4478 isn't about a clerical error. It isn't about a missing receipt. It is about a systematic transfer of wealth from your campaign donors to your personal household. He turned a page in the folder, the sound crisp and loud in the silent room. The investigation focuses on payments made to a consulting firm called the E Street Group, Patel continued. This firm is owned by a man named Tim Minette. Now, hiring a consultant is legal. Paying a consultant is legal. But the Federal Election Commission has very strict rules about the personal use of campaign funds. You cannot use donor money to pay your rent. You cannot use it to pay for your vacations. And you certainly cannot use it to enrich a romantic partner under the guise of professional services. Patel looked up, his gaze piercing. The timeline here is critical, and it is documented. He signaled to the aide, who placed a large poster board on an easel behind the witness table. It was a timeline, stark and linear, with dates highlighted in yellow. April 2018, Patel read from the chart. Your campaign begins paying E Street Group. The initial payments are modest, about $15,000 per month. This is consistent with standard digital consulting fees for a congressional race. He pointed to the next date, August 2018. Multiple witness statements, sworn statements gathered by the FBI, indicate that you and Mr. Minette began a personal, romantic relationship around this time. Both of you were married to other people. That is your private business. But what happened to the money is the public's business. Patel traced the line on the chart as it spiked upward. November 2018. Immediately following the alleged start of the affair, payments to E Street Group jump. They don't just double, they explode. By early 2019, your campaign is paying this single firm $180,000 per month. Let's put that in context, Patel said, leaning back. I had our analysts look at comparable campaigns. I looked at your colleague, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She has a similar national profile. She has a massive digital fundraising operation. In the entire 2020 cycle, her campaign paid their primary digital consultant roughly $47,000 for services rendered. The comparison hung in the air. You paid E Street Group $2.7 million, Patel said, the number landing like a physical blow. That is nearly 60 times what a comparable campaign spent. For what? Did you get 60 times the digital engagement? Did you get 60 times the fundraising yield? Or was the money the point? Omar's lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, his hand covering his mouth. Omar ignored him. She was staring at the chart, watching her political life be reduced to a math problem she couldn't solve. "Director," she said, her voice thin, stripped of its earlier bravado, "we have independent compliance audits that show—" "We have the bank records, Congresswoman," Patel cut her off, not rudely, but with the absolute authority of the evidence. "And bank records don't have narratives. They just have routing numbers." He pulled a specific document from the red folder. "The allegation in this file," Patel said, tapping the paper, "is that the E Street Group was essentially a pass-through entity, a laundromat. Money came in from donors who thought they were fighting for progressive causes. It went into your campaign account. You wrote a check to E Street Group for consulting. And then it went home with you. Because in March 2020, Patel said, delivering the coup de grace, you married Tim Minette. The man receiving the millions was now your husband. The money traveled in a circle, Congresswoman. From the donor, to the campaign, to the consultant, to the joint bank account. That isn't consulting. That is a kickback scheme. And under Title 52, Section 3114 of the United States Code, that is a federal crime. The room was absolutely still. The accusation was no longer vague. It was specific, quantified, and devastating. "But Director," Omar said, finding a shred of her old defiance, "you are conflating business revenue with personal income. My husband is a professional. He earned those fees." "Did he?" Patel asked softly. "Let's follow the money." "Because we did." He flipped to a new section of the folder labeled Forensic Disbursements. "Forensic accounting is a fascinating field," Patel mused, almost conversationally. "It strips away the labels we put on things and looks at where the cash actually lands. Let's look at a single transaction. Just one. April 2019. He held up a sheet of paper covered in lines of data. On April 15, 2019, your campaign wired $275,000 to E Street Group. The invoice listed Digital advertising and fundraising services. $250,000 in a single month, in an off-election year. Patel looked at her over the rim of the folder. We subpoenaed the bank records of E Street Group to see how that money was spent. If it was for advertising, we should see payments to Facebook, to Google, to media buyers, right? He waited. Omar said nothing. That's not what we found, Patel said. Of that $275,000, only $18,000 went to actual vendor costs. $18,000. That is less than 7%. Where did the rest go? Patel asked rhetorically. I'll tell you. He ticked the items off on his fingers. $100,000 was transferred the very next day to a personal LLC registered solely in Tim Mynett's name. Not the company name. His name. $75,000 went to a luxury travel concierge service, Patel continued. We cross-referenced the dates. That payment coincides perfectly with a 3-week trip to the Maldives, a trip that appears on Mr. Mynett's private Instagram account. White sand, blue water, first-class flights. And $50,000, Patel finished, his voice dropping to a hush, went to a residential real estate escrow company in Washington, D.C. That money was the down payment on a townhouse that, according to property records, is currently owned jointly by you and Mr. Mynett. The gallery gasped. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was a house. This was a vacation. This was the donor's money buying a lifestyle. So I have to ask, Congresswoman, Patel said, looking her dead in the eye. When a grandmother in Minneapolis sent you $25 because she believed you were fighting for health care, did she know she was buying you a beach house? This is out of context, Omar stammered, her face pale. I cannot speak to my husband's business expenses. These aren't business expenses, Patel snapped, his patience evaporating. A down payment on your shared home is not a business expense. A honeymoon in the Maldives is not a business expense. It is theft. It is wire fraud. And you know it. He didn't give her time to recover. He closed the campaign finance section and opened the next tab. It was marked Tax and Immigration. But the financial fraud is just the mechanism, Patel said. The cover-up is where it gets truly messy. Let's talk about your tax returns, specifically the years 2014 and 2015. We retrieved your joint tax filings for those years, Patel said. You filed as married filing jointly with a man named Ahmed Hirsi. He is the father of your children. You listed him as your spouse. You took the standard deduction for a married couple? Patel paused, letting the trap set. There is just one problem, Congresswoman. In 2014 and 2015, you were not legally married to Ahmed Hirsi. He pulled out a certified copy of a marriage certificate. According to the state of Minnesota, during that entire period, you were legally married to a man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. We have the certificate right here. Date of marriage, February 12, 2009. Date of divorce, 2017. You cannot have two husbands, Congresswoman, Patel said flatly. Not under American law. And you certainly cannot file federal taxes with one man while legally married to another. That is perjury. That is tax fraud. That is a felony. And it begs the question, Patel said, leaning forward, why were you married to Ahmed Elmi? We interviewed witnesses, 12 of them, neighbors, friends, community members. Not a single one of them ever saw you live with him. Not one. They all said you were living with Ahmed Hirsi the entire time. The allegation in this file, Patel said, tapping the red folder, is that the marriage to Elmi was a sham, a fraud committed solely to circumvent immigration laws. That is a federal crime that carries a penalty of 5 years in prison and stripping of citizenship. So, which is it? Patel asked. Did you commit tax fraud by lying about your husband? Or did you commit immigration fraud by marrying a man you never lived with? Because it has to be one of them. Omar was silent. The prosecutor was gone. In her place was a defendant, realizing that the evidence box was full and there was no way out. The air in the hearing room had become toxic. The revelation of the 2 marriages and the potential tax fraud had stripped away the last veneer of political theater. Ilhan Omar was no longer sparring. She was surviving. She sat hunched over the table, her eyes darting between her lawyer and the red folder, looking for an exit ramp that didn't exist. Kash Patel didn't give her one. He closed the red folder with a deliberate, heavy motion. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a different file. This one wasn't red. It was black, with a single strip of yellow tape across the top. The color code for sensitive counterintelligence information. The tax fraud and the immigration fraud are serious, Congresswoman, Patel said, his voice shifting from the sharp cadence of a prosecutor to the lower, graver tone of a national security official. They carry prison time, but they are ultimately domestic crimes. They are about greed. He placed his hand on the black folder. What we need to discuss now is different. This isn't about greed. This is about loyalty. This is about Foreign Agents Registration Act violations. This is about selling American foreign policy to the highest bidder. Omar's head snapped up. I meet with foreign officials all the time, she stammered, trying to regain her footing. That is part of my job on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Meeting them is your job, Patel corrected her. Taking money from them is a felony. He opened the folder. The pages inside were heavily redacted, with only specific paragraphs left visible. October 2017, Patel began. You traveled to Istanbul, Turkey. It was listed as a cultural exchange. While there, you held a private, closed-door meeting with officials from the Qatari government, specifically representatives from the Qatari embassy and the Qatar Foundation. I meet with many people, Omar said, her voice tight. Yes, you do, Patel agreed. But usually, you don't change your entire legislative agenda immediately afterward. He pulled out a timeline graphic. Before that meeting, Patel noted, pointing to the dates, your criticism of Gulf nations was broad. After that meeting, it became laser-focused. Within 6 months, you became the loudest critic in Congress of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Qatar's regional rivals. You introduced bills to block arms sales to them. You tweeted about their human rights abuses daily. But Qatar, Patel asked. Qatar has many of the same human rights issues. They use slave labor. They fund Hamas. And yet, from you, silence. Absolute, total silence. I speak out where I think it is appropriate, Omar shouted, banging her hand on the table. And it seems you think it's appropriate when the check clears, Patel said coldly. He held up a financial ledger. In 2018, 2019, and 2020, Patel read, your campaign received $187,000 in bundled donations. We traced the source. These weren't grassroots donors from Minnesota. These were individuals and entities with documented business ties to Qatar Airways, the Qatar Foundation, and the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund. We have the list right here, Patel said, tapping the paper. Page 22 of your folder. Donors who have never stepped foot in Minnesota, but who have very deep pockets in Doha. Receiving donations is legal, Omar insisted, sweat visible on her brow now. American citizens can donate to whoever they want. True, Patel said. But the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, requires anyone who acts as an agent of a foreign government to register with the Justice Department. If you advocate for a foreign power in exchange for compensation, even if that compensation is campaign donations, you are an unregistered foreign agent. That is a felony. Just ask Paul Manafort. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. We obtained a warrant, Congresswoman. A federal judge signed it because he saw probable cause of a crime. We accessed your WhatsApp messages. The color drained from Omar's face so completely, she looked like a ghost. We have messages between you and an intermediary, Patel said. The name is redacted in your folder, but I can tell you he is a Qatari national with direct ties to the Emir's office. Patel picked up his phone, scrolling to a screenshot. I can't read the messages verbatim without further declassification, Patel said, but I can summarize the content. The messages discuss, and I am quoting the DOJ summary here, compensation for advocacy on Gulf policy issues. They discuss ensuring a favorable congressional stance on a sanctions vote that would have hurt Qatar. He looked up. Congresswoman, the message dated November 4, 2019, explicitly asks, has the transfer been confirmed? The vote is next week. The room was deathly silent. Would you like to explain to this committee, Patel asked, his voice ringing with the finality of a judgment, what transfer you were waiting for before you cast a vote on United States foreign policy? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Has the transfer been confirmed? Ilhan Omar stared at the black folder. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the page Patel had referenced, page 47. Her eyes scanned the highlighted text of the intercepted messages. The transfer, the advocacy, the dates that matched the donations. It was all there. She looked at her lawyer in the gallery. He was no longer shaking his head. He was standing up, his face pale, making a slashing motion across his throat. Cut it. Stop. Do not speak. For the first time in her career, Ilhan Omar was terrified. This wasn't a Twitter spat. This wasn't a cable news argument she could spin with accusations of Islamophobia. This was federal prison. This was the FBI director reading her own text messages back to her on live television. Congresswoman, Patel prompted gently, I asked you a question. What transfer were you discussing with a representative of the Qatari government 1 week before a sanctions vote? The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The cameras zoomed in on her face. Beads of sweat were visible on her upper lip. Her hands were trembling so violently she had to clasp them together on the table to stop them from shaking. Chairman Mike Johnson leaned into his microphone. Congresswoman Omar, do you need a moment to consult with your attorney? She didn't answer him. She couldn't take her eyes off the black folder. Congresswoman, Patel said, his voice devoid of malice, just professional detachment. If you answer this question, and you lie, that is a fresh count of perjury. If you answer truthfully, you are admitting to a violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. He paused. You have a third option. Everyone in the room knew what the third option was. It was the option of last resort. It was the option that saved your liberty but destroyed your career. Omar looked at her lawyer one last time. He nodded slowly, his expression grim. She took a shaky breath. She leaned toward the microphone. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. On the advice of counsel, she whispered. The room erupted in a low murmur. She raised a hand to silence it, but her hand was weak. "On the advice of counsel," she said, her voice gaining a little strength but losing all dignity, "regarding the questions about the Qatar meetings and the Farah allegations." She closed her eyes. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination." 11:47 a.m. The moment was frozen in time. The room exploded. It was absolute pandemonium. Journalists were sprinting for the doors to file the alert. Republicans were shouting. Democrats were staring at the floor, realizing the political fallout that was about to hit them. Cameras flashed in a strobe light frenzy, capturing the image of a sitting congresswoman pleading the Fifth to avoid admitting she was a foreign agent. "Order! Order in the committee!" Chairman Johnson banged his gavel, the sound lost in the chaos. Kash Patel sat quietly at the witness table. He closed the black folder. He folded his hands. He looked almost sad, like a doctor who had just pronounced a time of death. When the noise finally subsided enough for him to be heard, Patel leaned into the microphone one last time. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice cutting through the remaining murmurs, "I want to be clear. Invoking your Fifth Amendment rights is completely legal. It is a constitutional protection we all have. It is not an admission of guilt in a court of law." He paused, looking her dead in the eye. "But I need to inform you as a courtesy. The Department of Justice Public Integrity Section has been monitoring this hearing. Based on your invocation of the Fifth Amendment regarding specific questions of foreign influence, they have indicated they will request an expedited grand jury review of case file 2021 DC 4478. The blood drained from Omar's face. Expedited review. Grand jury. "I have no further information to provide at this time," Patel said. He sat back. The hearing was over. Chairman Johnson looked around the room, saw the wreckage of a political career strewn across the witness table, and made the only decision he could. "This hearing is in recess," Johnson declared, "pending consultation with committee counsel. We will reconvene at a time to be determined." The gavel fell. Ilhan Omar stood up. She didn't look at Patel. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked like a sleepwalker. Her staff surrounded her, forming a human shield, pushing through the mob of reporters. They rushed her out the side door, down the hallway, and toward the elevators. But she couldn't outrun the footage. The clip of her face at 11:47 a.m., eyes wide, mouth open, the realization that she had walked into a trap of her own making, was already circling the globe. She had come to the hearing to destroy Kash Patel. She had come to prosecute the FBI. Instead, she had provided the final piece of evidence for her own indictment. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game was over. The timestamp would be burned into the digital archives of C-SPAN forever. It was the precise second Ilhan Omar's political career struck an iceberg she had steered the ship directly toward. The moment she uttered the words, "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right," the hearing room ceased to be a legislative body and became a gladiatorial arena descending into anarchy. The silence that had held the room captive during Kash Patel's presentation shattered instantly. It was replaced by a roar, a cacophony of shouting, camera shutters firing in machine gun bursts, and the frantic clatter of 100 reporters typing the same headline simultaneously. "Order! Order in the committee!" Chairman Mike Johnson banged his gavel furiously, the sharp crack, 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 barely audible over the din. "The committee will come to order." But there was no order to be had. The genie was out of the bottle. A sitting member of Congress, a darling of the progressive movement, had just pleaded the Fifth to avoid incriminating herself in a foreign influence scheme she had demanded be investigated. Kash Patel sat motionless amidst the chaos. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply closed the black folder marked Farah Qatar, aligned it perfectly with the red folder marked Campaign Finance, and folded his hands on top of them. He looked like a surgeon who had successfully removed a tumor, clinical, professional, and entirely detached from the mess. When the noise finally subsided enough for a voice to be heard, Patel leaned into his microphone for the final time. "Congresswoman," Patel said, his voice cutting through the remaining murmurs like a knife. "I want to be clear. Invoking your Fifth Amendment rights is completely legal. It is a constitutional protection we all have. It is not an admission of guilt in a court of law." He paused, looking her dead in the eye, ensuring the cameras caught the gravity of his next words. "But I need to inform you as a courtesy. The Department of Justice Public Integrity Section has been monitoring this hearing live. Based on your invocation of the Fifth Amendment regarding specific questions of foreign influence, they have indicated via secure comms that they will request an expedited grand jury review of Case File 2021 DC 4478. The blood drained from Omar's face. Expedited review. Grand jury. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "I have no further information to provide at this time," Patel said. He capped his pen and sat back. Chairman Johnson looked at the wreckage of the hearing. The stunned Democrats, the vindicated Republicans, the shell-shocked witness, and made the only decision possible. "This hearing is in recess," Johnson declared, slamming the gavel down one last time. "Pending consultation with committee counsel. We will reconvene at a time to be determined." The feed cut, but the drama was just beginning. Ilhan Omar stood up. It was a jerky, uncoordinated movement. She didn't look at Patel. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked like a sleepwalker waking up in a burning building. Her staff, usually aggressive and vocal, swarmed around her in a silent, terrified phalanx. They formed a human shield, blocking the camera lenses with their bodies and portfolios, rushing her toward the side exit. "Congresswoman, did you take money from Qatar? Congresswoman, are you resigning? Congresswoman, is your marriage a sham?" The questions from the press pool were shouted like accusations. Omar didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, her eyes glassy, propelled forward only by the hands of her aides pushing her toward the elevators. They practically threw her into the waiting black SUV in the underground garage, tires screeching as the driver sped away from the Capitol complex. But she couldn't outrun the internet. By 12 p.m., 13 minutes after the hearing ended, the clip of her face at 11:47 a.m. had 5 million views. It was the defining image of the year. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open, the realization of total defeat, frozen in high definition. Twitter was in meltdown mode. The hashtag Omar Indictment was trending #1 worldwide, displacing the Super Bowl and the Oscars. Kash Patel was #2. Plead the Fifth was #3. The memes were instant and brutal. Top text, demands transparency. Bottom text, pleads the Fifth. Image, Omar's terrified face. Another one showed Kash Patel opening the red folder with the caption, "Checkmate in 3 moves." Cable news was in a state of emergency. CNN broke into regular programming with a breaking news banner that flashed urgent red. Explosive hearing. Omar invokes Fifth Amendment amid FBI questions. Their legal analysts were struggling. "While the Fifth Amendment is a right," one clearly uncomfortable analyst stammered, "politically, Politically, this is a nuclear explosion. You cannot demand an investigation and then refuse to answer questions about it. It looks like an admission. Fox News wasn't holding back. They were running the 11:47 moment on a loop. Kash Patel destroys narrative, the Chiron read. Their commentators were already drafting the political obituary. Back in his office, Kash Patel was packing up his briefcase. A junior staffer asked him if he wanted to release a statement, to take a victory lap. Patel shook his head. "No statement," he said quietly. "The documents spoke for themselves. Anything else is just noise. We did our job. Now it's up to the jury." He walked out of the Rayburn building, ignoring the shout of reporters, and got into his sedan. He didn't check Twitter. He didn't watch the news. He went back to the J. Edgar Hoover building to finish his paperwork. To him, Ilhan Omar wasn't a celebrity or a villain. She was just a subject in case file 2021 DC 4478. And the file was now closed. If the hearing was the crash, the next 48 hours were the fire that consumed the wreckage. Political power is a strange substance. It looks solid, immovable, like granite, right up until the moment it evaporates into mist. For Ilhan Omar, the evaporation began on day 2. The morning after the hearing, the Washington Post, a paper that had often been sympathetic to the Squad, published a front-page deep dive titled "The Case Against Omar: How a Routine Hearing Became a Political Catastrophe." The article didn't take sides. It didn't need to. It simply laid out the timeline Kash Patel had presented. It printed the charts. It printed the transcripts of the WhatsApp messages. It printed the marriage certificate. When laid out in black and white ink, stripped of cable news shouting, the evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a forensic accounting of fraud. The New York Times followed with an analytical piece. When transparency backfires, the strategic failure of the oversight hearing. The conclusion was damning. Omar had walked into a trap of her own making. She had brought a narrative to a document fight. But the silence from her allies was far louder than the noise from her critics. Nancy Pelosi's office was bombarded with requests for comment. For 24 hours, silence. Finally, a brief, sterile statement was released. The Speaker believes in the presumption of innocence and due process. She will have no further comment on ongoing legal matters. Translation: You are on your own. The Squad, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, usually so vocal, so quick to defend each other on Twitter, went dark. Their accounts posted about student loans, about climate change, about local festivals. Not a single mention of Ilhan Omar. Not a single defense of her actions. They saw the poll numbers. They saw the 11:47 meme. They knew that defending her now meant tying themselves to the anchor of a sinking ship. The only sound from the progressive wing was the sound of distancing. By day 3, the political mechanism began to grind her down. The House Ethics Committee announced a preliminary review of the allegations, a formality that allowed leadership to act. Republican leadership brought a privileged resolution to the floor. House Resolution 902, calling for the immediate removal of Representative Ilhan Omar from the Foreign Affairs Committee pending the resolution of federal investigations. Usually, these votes are strictly party line. The Democrats circle the wagons. But not this time. The foreign agents allegation had spooked the moderates. The idea that a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee was secretly coordinating with Qatar was radioactive. The vote was scheduled for 4 p.m. on Thursday. Omar didn't go to the floor. She sat in her office, curtains drawn, watching the C-SPAN feed. She watched as the names scrolled by. The final tally was 312 to 119. 67 Democrats voted yes. 67 members of her own party crossed the aisle to strip her of her power. It was a stunning rebuke. It wasn't just the Blue Dogs. It was suburban moderates, national security Democrats, people who had smiled at her in the hallway a week ago. They looked at the evidence Kash Patel had presented, specifically the FARA violations, and decided she was a liability they could not afford. That vote ended her effective career in Congress. She was now a pariah, stripped of her committee, isolated by her caucus, and awaiting indictment. And the indictment came faster than anyone expected. 6 days after the hearing, the Department of Justice held a press conference. It was brief, clinical, and devastating. The Attorney General, flanked by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, stepped to the podium. After reviewing evidence presented in the House Oversight Committee hearing, as well as additional evidence gathered by the FBI over the past 18 months, the Department of Justice has obtained indictments from a federal grand jury. He adjusted his glasses and read from the sheet. We are announcing 51 counts against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. The list was exhaustive. 12 counts of wire fraud, campaign finance violations, 18 counts of making false statements to the FEC, 11 counts of filing false federal tax returns, 6 counts of conspiracy to commit immigration fraud, 4 counts of violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The defendant will be arraigned next Tuesday, the AG concluded. We will have no further comment. 51 counts. The number was staggering. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was a legal avalanche. In Minnesota's 5th District, the dam broke. A primary challenger emerged within 48 hours of the indictment. She was a moderate Democrat, a former city councilwoman with a background in urban planning and zero baggage. Her announcement speech was filmed in front of a community center, not a television studio. I'm running, she said, because Minnesota deserves representation focused on our families, not on defending against federal indictments. We need a congresswoman who works for Minneapolis, not for Qatar. The money followed instantly. Business groups, pro-Israel PACs, and even Democratic donor networks that had been privately frustrated with Omar for years flooded the challenger's coffers. Omar's own fundraising dried up. The Justice Democrats' email list, usually a cash cow, yielded nothing. The donors felt betrayed. They had given money to fight the power, not to buy a townhouse for her husband. 3 months later, I sat down with a senior GOP staffer who had been in the room during the hearing. We met at a dive bar on Capitol Hill, away from the prying eyes of the press. Did Kash know? I asked him. Did he know she was going to plead the Fifth? The staffer swirled his bourbon and smiled a thin, knowing smile. Kash Patel has been a prosecutor and an intelligence official for 20 years, the staffer said. He knows how the game is played. When she subpoenaed him, the staffer continued, she thought she was summoning a witness. She thought she could badger him, get a soundbite, and go on Maddow. But Kash, he didn't prepare for a hearing. He prepared for a trial. He knew that if he brought the documents, the red folders, the black folders, the cleared summaries, she would have 2 choices. She could lie and catch a perjury charge, or she could plead the Fifth and end her career. The staffer finished his drink. She brought a narrative to a gunfight, he said. He brought the receipts. And in this town, eventually, the receipts always win. The indictment was the nail in the coffin, but the primary election was the funeral. In the months following the hearing, Minnesota's 5th Congressional District underwent a political transformation that few pundits thought possible. For years, Ilhan Omar had held the seat with a grip of iron, fortified by name recognition, a massive fundraising apparatus, and the protective armor of identity politics. But the 1147 moment had shattered that armor. The voters of Minneapolis, who had once prided themselves on sending a firebrand to Washington, were now watching their representative defend herself against 51 federal counts of fraud. The primary challenger, Sarah Peterson, a pragmatic city councilwoman with a background in labor law and zero patience for performative politics, didn't need to run a smear campaign. She just ran the tape. Her television ads were devastatingly simple. They didn't feature ominous music or grainy filters. They just played the clip. Video, Kash Patel reading the WhatsApp message about the transfer. Video, Ilhan Omar's face turning pale. Video, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right. Text on screen. She didn't answer them, but she has to answer to you. The effect was visceral. Omar's internal polling, leaked to Politico 3 weeks before the vote, showed her trailing by 23 points. It was a collapse of historic proportions. Her team tried everything. They claimed the audio was manipulated. They claimed the documents were forged. They claimed the entire hearing was a deep state fabrication. But these defenses rang hollow against the sheer weight of the evidence Kash Patel had placed into the public record. The debates were a disaster. In the only televised debate Omar agreed to attend, the moderator didn't ask about policy. She asked about the townhouse. "Congresswoman," the moderator asked, "can you explain to the voters why campaign funds were used for a down payment on a home you co-own?" Omar froze. For a split second, the viewers saw the same look from the hearing, the look of a trapped animal. She launched into a rehearsed speech about persecution, about fighting for the marginalized, about her opponents being afraid of her power. Sarah Peterson simply leaned into her microphone and asked, "Did you pay the money back?" Omar didn't answer. She didn't have to. Election Day came on a humid Tuesday in August. The turnout was record-breaking. Usually, incumbents in safe districts coast through primaries with low engagement. But this was different. This was a referendum on integrity. By 8:20 p.m., the polls closed. By 8:15 p.m., the networks called the race. It wasn't a contest. It was an eviction. Sarah Peterson, 64%. Ilhan Omar, 31%. Ilhan Omar didn't just lose. She was annihilated. She lost the suburbs. She lost the working-class neighborhoods. She even lost significant ground in the Somali-American community, where elders had grown tired of the constant scandals and the shame brought upon their diaspora by the allegations of fraud. Her concession speech was a study in bitterness. Standing in a half-empty ballroom, surrounded by a dwindling group of loyalists, she didn't congratulate her opponent. She didn't accept responsibility. "We were defeated today," she told the cameras, her voice shaking with rage. "Not by the voters, but by a conspiracy of corporate money, right-wing law enforcement, and a media that refuses to tell the truth." She left the stage without taking questions. As she walked off, a reporter shouted, "Congresswoman, are you worried about the trial in September?" She didn't look back, but the answer was written in the slump of her shoulders. She was no longer a rising star of the Democratic Party. She was a defendant. The machinery of Washington, famously unsentimental, moved on instantly. Her office on Capitol Hill was already being eyed by incoming freshmen. Her committee seats had already been reassigned. The Squad documentary that had been in production for 2 years was quietly shelved by Netflix. The advance for her second memoir was canceled. Power in D.C. is a currency, and Ilhan Omar was bankrupt. While Ilhan Omar's world was collapsing into legal fees and court dates, Kash Patel was back at the J. Edgar Hoover building. There was no champagne toast. There was no victory lap on Hannity. There was no book tour. The morning after the primary election, Patel was at his desk at 6:30 a.m., reviewing case files on a human trafficking ring in Ohio. To him, the Omar hearing hadn't been a political event. It had been a job performance. He had been subpoenaed. He had been asked questions. He had provided answers backed by evidence. That was the job. But outside the walls of the FBI, the Patel standard had changed the game forever. The hearing became a watershed moment in congressional oversight. For decades, members of Congress had treated hearings as grandstanding opportunities, places to yell at bureaucrats, clip a soundbite for fundraising emails, and face zero consequences. They assumed that the officials sitting at the witness table would be polite, submissive, and terrified of political retribution. Kash Patel had flipped the board. He taught Washington a lesson that it would not soon forget. Transparency cuts both ways. If you demand an investigation, you better be clean. If you ask to see the files, you better be ready for what's in them. If you accuse a prosecutor of corruption, you better not have wire fraud in your own bank account. The red folder became a symbol. In the months following the hearing, other committee hearings changed. Members of Congress were suddenly more cautious. They did their homework. They stopped asking rhetorical questions they didn't know the answer to. The fear of being Patel'd, of having your own record read back to you on live television, instilled a newfound, albeit forced, sense of discipline in the legislative branch. 6 months after the primary, Ilhan Omar stood in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. She wasn't wearing a designer suit. She was wearing a simple gray blazer. She looked tired. The arrogance that had defined her career was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out look of someone facing the reality of federal sentencing guidelines. Her lawyers had tried to get the charges dismissed. They argued executive privilege. They argued speech and debate clause protections. They argued political bias. The judge, a no-nonsense jurist appointed decades ago, rejected every motion. The evidence, the judge wrote in his ruling, is not political. Bank transfers are not political. Tax returns are not political. The law applies to congresswomen just as it applies to carpenters. On the eve of the trial, her legal team reached a plea agreement to avoid the spectacle of a 6-week trial that would air every humiliating detail of her finances and personal life. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of failing to register as a foreign agent. The sentence was severe: 24 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, and restitution of $1.1 million to her campaign donors. As the bailiffs led her away, there were no cameras in the courtroom. There was no live stream. There were just the sketches of a courtroom artist, capturing the final fall of a woman who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of other people's money. Kash Patel didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't issue a statement celebrating the verdict. When asked about it by a reporter during a press gaggle on an unrelated matter, his response was brief. "The FBI investigates crimes," Patel said, his face unreadable. "We follow the facts wherever they lead. Sometimes they lead to a street corner. Sometimes they lead to the halls of Congress. Justice is blind to the zip code." He turned and walked back into the building. The story of Ilhan Omar and Kash Patel is more than a political scandal. It is a cautionary tale about hubris. It is a reminder that in the digital age, where every transaction leaves a trace and every message is stored, the truth is harder to hide than ever before. Omar built a career on the narrative of victimhood, using her identity as a shield against scrutiny. She believed that her position protected her from the consequences of her actions. She believed she could demand accountability from others while offering none herself. Kash Patel proved her wrong, not with insults, not with shouting, but with a red folder, a black folder, and the quiet confidence of a man who knows he has the goods. The Louisiana lesson taught us about asking simple questions. The Patel protocol taught us about having the receipts. Justice doesn't scream. It doesn't tweet. It waits. It gathers evidence. And when the moment is right, it speaks with a voice that cannot be ignored. Who needs to see the red folder next? Tell us in the comments. Because the files are open, the evidence is real, and we are just getting started. Justice is coming.